start on the first page with water access lots.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm just going to follow in the order of my recommendations from 1 to 14. So I'll do it that way. So as you already know, this issue has consumed a significant amount of time and discussion, and there has been a lot said about this particular issue. As you know, the existing official plan states that new water access lots can only be created provided long-term parking facilities are provided, and this has meant historically that the applicants have to provide a letter from a marina indicating that vehicular parking was available, and the owner would be required to enter into an agreement that would require owners to not utilize public parking and docking as a means of access to the property. Waterfront access lots, waterfront landings are also an alternative long-term access possibility in the township as well. So through the process of developing the official plan, there's been lots of discussion and a lot of back and forth on this particular issue. And in the end, it was directed that the official plan contain policies that require deeded access only in cases where water access lots were proposed. So the above policy direction was then implemented to basically permit water access on a mainland waterfront landing, individual water access point, or plan a condominium involving boat slips. And all of those circumstances would have required some form of deeded access. We also included as an additional option in the draft official plan, new policies on individual water access points, which would serve up to 2 residential lots that cannot be accessed by a road. And those permissions would be enshrined in your implementing zoning bylaw when it is updated in the future. However, notwithstanding that, there would still be a requirement for deeded access even in those cases. In response to the survey question on whether this was a good idea or not, it was basically split, 52 saying yes and 48% saying no. And based on a review of these comments, those that were opposed were to the idea generally indicated that the potential was very remote for securing deeded access or an easement on a property. And those in favor believe that the long-term parking of cars and trailers should not be occurring on roads and should be occurring in places where there was confirmed and long-term access. After thinking about it and looking at all of the comments, I don't think personally that this is the most appropriate way to deal with the issue with access. I don't think it's very likely that deeded access will be secured. Waterfront property is very expensive. Folks are not going to be consenting to granting easements or having easements on their property. It reduces the value and their saleability over the long term. So as a consequence, I don't think it'll be possible to really implement this policy. So with this in mind, it is my recommendation that the requirement for deeded access not be carried forward into the next draft, and that a long-term lease agreement with the marina be considered an acceptable additional option. So what I'm suggesting is that the deeded access piece come out. I do recommend that the new policies on individual water access points be carried forward into the next draft. And when these policies are implemented in the township zoning bylaw, another option will be made available. So in addition, I also recommend that the official plan include a policy that requires the owners of lots to enter into an agreement with the township that indicates that they will not park or moor watercraft on municipal lands to access their property. So as a consequence, what I'm suggesting is an enhancement of the status quo with one additional option for consideration, that being the individual water access points. So going to recommendation number 1 in the memorandum, I'll summarize and not read this, but deeded access not be a requirement. It can still obviously be an option available to an owner if desired. A new policy be included in the official plan that requires the owners of new lots to enter into an agreement with the township that indicates they will not park vehicles or moor watercraft on municipal lands, as well as binding provisions that deal with the circumstance where the marina ceases to operate, which could happen and hopefully doesn't. The draft policies would also permit individual water access points on private properties and that be carried forward into the next draft of the official plan, with the requirement that there be a long-term lease on those individual water access properties as well. And that lastly, the official plan contains supportive language that supports the retention of existing marinas and the reasonable expansion of these marinas in the future. So that's recommendation number one, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McDonald. And I don't know if you had a chance to see Mr. Morgan's letter with the wording. I assume that you will take that into consideration going forward.
Yes, I will, Chair Bridgman. His suggestions were very well taken. I'm not sure I would incorporate all of the language he has suggested because it is kind of legalese for an official plan, but I understand his points and will consider them.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Mayor Harding.
Thank you very much. I agree with the recommendation. Point B, the new policy requiring owners new lots to enter into an agreement with the township. I appreciate my own vehicles, but what about guest vehicles? People regularly come up and they need extra places to park. Do we want to put a provision in there? Do we want to understand that, we do have on-street parking for guests and overflows, and even in mainland properties, if you happen to have a number of people over, sometimes they do park on the road. Or do we want a limitation? Or do we want to just even ask the question of what guest parking in that agreement, what the plan is for guest parking, so we have an idea for that? Thank you.
Okay, Mr. McDonald.
I think through you to chair, to the mayor, I think that's an excellent suggestion. Not sure how exactly we would operationalize something like that, but I think it's worth asking the question and considering it. And perhaps there could be in the agreement some acknowledgement that guest parking for up to a certain number is also incorporated, but anything above that isn't. So we'd have to look at that and think about it, but I think you're on the right track. I think that's a good idea.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Kelly.
Thank you, and through you, I generally agree with the changes that are proposed. I do have three questions, specifically relating to the addition of a long-term lease with a marine operator. Number one, I don't know what long-term means, 2 years, 5 years, 20 years. Number two, I don't know, this isn't effective unless we have some way to try to establish an estimate of an appropriate number of parking spaces, and whether that's tied to the number of bedrooms or the square footage of the specific cottage or whatever it is. I don't know, but one's not ever going to be enough. And the more troubling one is the last one. And I know we had this debate earlier on another issue, but the issue of the last line, binding provisions that deal with a circumstance where the marina ceases to operate. I have no idea what binding provisions could put in place that would be effective through a bankruptcy. And as a result, I don't know what that means. So those are my questions. Thank you.
Fair enough. Mr. McDonald.
Through you, Chair Bridgman, that's an excellent question about the binding provisions. I've been thinking about that as well. I'm going to ask Mr. Pink to provide his thoughts because he assisted with this as well too. But certainly if a marina closes, the marina's gone. It's pretty hard to force someone to park at something that doesn't exist anymore. And I don't think we're suggesting that if the marina is gone, that somehow the person can't occupy his property anymore. So I don't think that's in the cards either. So it's a good question. It's something we need to think about. We do need to think about circumstances where marinas cease. Maybe we think about including backup plans or backup strategies in these agreements as well in those kinds of cases. But I don't have a good answer for you right now. It's something we wanted to run by this committee and get their thoughts on, and we'll certainly explore it further. Mr. Pink, anything you can add to that?
Mr. Pink.
Good morning, committee. Similar to what Mr. McDonald has said, I think keep in mind at this level, these are official plan policies, and a lot of these finer details we worked out in negotiations in crafting those agreements when they're approved as conditions of consent. So exactly how many years, how many vehicles, it may depend again on the size of the lots, the number of lots, the intended usage, etc. And again, it's certainly an excellent question. in regards to when a marina ceases to operate. But I think, as Mr. McDonald noted, I think there needs to be some recognition that that could occur. And if that were to occur, those owners are obligated to ensure that they're not going to revert to utilizing public docking, public parking, and that they will seek out either another marina or a waterfront landing or deeded access, etc. And it would obligate them to do so. The exact details, again, we can work out as we negotiate these agreements. But I think something to recognize that that's a possibility, and certainly echo Mr. McDonald's comments. There's no intention to strip the ability for someone to inhabit their property or access it, but we want to ensure that appropriate access continues to be available.
Okay, thank you.
And then on the issue of the term of the contract, I'm going to ask Mr. Diamond to provide his thoughts on that in terms of how long the lease should be for with the marina operator.
Okay, Mr. Diamond, welcome.
Good morning. A lot of this, including the number of parking spaces, is a bylaw issue. I know we've been criticized for having too many numbers in the official plan already. In terms of the opportunity for a long-term lease, of course, under the Planning Act, you can do a lease for 21 years less a day without getting Planning Act approval. But that's important because that lease also is a binding contract between the property owner and the person who is counting on that land for deeded access. I've seen this situation occur before where that binding contract, then if there's a bankruptcy with the marina, it's a contract that flows through. I don't know all the legal obligations, but when you have a long-term contract, it does provide better security for ensuring that requirement to provide that access is maintained and is tied to the property. But it can't be for more than 21 years without planning approval of some sort.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Diamond. Councillor Mazan.
Thank you, and through you, just two quick comments. The first was just when the mayor was talking about visitors or to an island property. I think that also extends to the construction and service industry as well, because that has been a bit of an issue. So just as he brought that up, I just think we need to also be contemplating how we excuse me, address that. And the second thing I wanted to pick up on, I think it was Mr. Potto's comments. We're talking about marinas right now, but there are quite a few of our constituents who actually do use private clubs as their primary parking. And I'm not sure how that could, not that I'm not sure, I just would like to support his comment that that should be contemplated as well. Thank you.
Mr. McDonald, we could just add that in as part of the deemed agreements, I would think.
Yes, I would agree with that. That was an excellent suggestion he made.
Okay. Councillor Jaglowitz.
Thank you, Chair. I have great difficulty with this, but I do understand the program. It's quite clear that the current situation is unacceptable, as has been pointed out lately. So here are my comments. In Mr. McDonald's notes, he indicates that the official plan proposes to substantially increase the minimum lot sizes for island lots, and there will be fewer of them. So I would like to have this subject revisited in the event that those restrictions or those further things are not implemented. So that's number one. Number two is when you talk about a lease, 21 years less a day, I assume when you're talking about it carrying forward, you're talking about it being registered on title to the marina. I assume that's what you're talking about, because if that lease is only between the operator of the marina and that person, then if the operator fails to meet his obligations, that lease will be lost. So that causes a great problem. And I also understand that the official plan is not the place to put zoning restrictions, but it should set the framework for it. And I believe the framework here should be that there a lot not be created unless there's satisfaction that there is a long-term lease for the assumed people that will be using that lot. And that's difficult and may have to be done on a case-by-case basis. But if you allow the lot to be created without something, then we'll be back in the situation of Walker's Point, where when that parking that those people relied upon is maybe in jeopardy or they have more people, then those people come back to the municipality. So I understand it's a difficult subject, and I think we're moving in the right direction, because I do think deeded access, although it would solve the problem, is probably unworkable. So I'll support this going forward, but I think the OP has to address it. It can't just be silent and leave it to an individual consideration. So those are my comments.
Thank you. Mr. McDonald, I'd be interested in hearing your comments on not being silent, and lot creation can't happen until we know that there's a lease. Is that part of an OP?
Yeah, it is. And how I envision the policies working is that when someone makes an application for consent, they have to demonstrate that they're conforming with the official plan and what it says. And if the official plan requires someone to demonstrate that they have a solution for access over the long term, that needs to be furnished and considered by the Committee of Adjustment when the application is initially being heard by them. If they're satisfied, then the committee would then attach a condition to their decision, which requires them to furnish the actual contract or the lease or whatever it is prior to the committee and the township signing off on the new lot being created. So there are 2 steps involved in going through this process, and I think that provides enough security to the township that there will be that access provided. In the end, there always will be a circumstance where something doesn't work out as planned. That's life. The best we can do is try to make sure that doesn't happen through the application process.
Okay, thank you. And the question about being registered on title with the marina, I found that interesting. Is that something that we can dictate?
I would have to think about that a little bit more, and unless David or Jim has a comment on that. I'm registering something on title typically happens when you have some kind of planning act approval or some long-term arrangement in place. It doesn't typically happen for anything that is short-term, but I get the idea because the operator of the marina may be different than the owner of the marina. So that's something to think about going forward. I would ask to leave that with us unless Mr. Diamond or Mr. Pink has a thought on that.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go with Mr. Diamond and then Mr. Pink. Mr. Diamond?
Thank you. I want to preface this by saying that we have boosted up the policies that support marinas in the official plan and provided some greater flexibilities for those marinas to operate. At the same time, they're all subject to site plan control. And at some stage, someone is going to have to look at the marinas in Muskoka Lakes and, in a perfect situation, do it in conjunction with the Township of Seguin and say, how many water access lots are there now and how many parking spaces are there now, and determine what the real supply and demand is. But through the site plan approval process with the marinas, we can tie them into a number of parking spaces and the use of those parking spaces, but it requires a site plan agreement between the marina operator and the municipality to do that. It's a complicated process. Sometime down the road, probably something the township will have to do.
Supplementary? Oh, sorry.
Let's let Mr. Pink make his comment first, Councillor Jaglowitz. Mr. Pink.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry. Just quickly, I think it's important to note that the long-term lease agreement is obviously a contract or agreement between 2 other parties that the municipality is not a party to. So it is between the marina and the property owner. But further to the previous points we made about, and this already occurs, we already have required for many years an agreement registered on title between the municipality and the property owner that they are not going to utilize municipal docking and parking. And as we talked about just a moment ago, as well as binding provisions that deal when with the circumstance where the marina ceases to operate. The way I envision part of the implementation, in addition to what Mr. McDonald said, is that consent agreement that recognizes they're not going to utilize municipal docking and parking will also reference the long-term lease with that marina or waterfront landing or what have you. Or we haven't talked about the deeded access is still an option available to an island owner, but you still need an agreement registered on title with the municipality that will bind those two properties together. Or in the case of a marina or waterfront landing, that a long-term lease agreement shall be in place to our satisfaction. So there's some interplay there, but I think Mr. McDonald outlined how I envision the process to be implemented. Those details will have to be provided with the application, and if approved by committee, they will have to fulfill conditions which include agreements with other parties and with the municipality. I hope that helps clarify.
Okay, thank you. Supplementary, Councillor Jagowitz?
Yes, I just wanted to follow on that. And I wasn't referring to a registration on title of the island. I was referring to a registration on title for the person providing the access. And it's the similar to when a person obtains a right of way. And I know this because I just went through some personal experience. When you obtain a right of way over somebody else's property, you can register it on title to that person's property. And that's good for this 21 years less a day. If you want permanent access, you have to go through a land severance and get the municipality involved, okay? I don't think that's what I envision. I just envision that the long-term lease would be registered on the property of the marina or the private club or the individual's property who's providing the access. That gives some degree of assurance without interfering. Without that registration, it's kind of a useless document, but I'll leave it at that point because I understand we're getting into the nitty-gritty now. But I think the OP should have some strong wording that it's not just a letter from a marina or an agreement that lasts for 5 years with a 5-year renewal. That's not a long-term lease, in my view. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Edwards.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. I think this could be a winning situation for everybody. If I owned a marina and I had a 21-year lease from Islanders, one, it would help my business plan if I was borrowing. Two, if I was to sell the marina, I could then say I've got so many leases with 20 years left, so many with 15 years left, so that it would make the marinas more viable. Not only that, if they wanted to increase their parking, they could say, you know, Islander number 1 wants 3 parking spaces, another one wants 4, or something like that. So it would help that. So I think this is a win-win. I wouldn't burden people with having deeded access on the water. It's just too cumbersome. But I think it would help our marinas and that become more viable. And I think it's a win for everyone. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mayor Harding.
Thank you. As far as registration of this lease on the marina's lands, I think that's a little bit onerous on the marina. Adds extra legal costs, and we are really, I think Mr. Potto commented, we're dealing with a sledgehammer to solve a small problem at the end of the day. I think the bigger problem, and I love where the way the direction's going and that we have to demonstrate we have a lease. But the real problem that we have not really identified in this official plan is, I'll take Parker's Marina, for example, where you can park 500 boats. What happens if that marina closes? We're talking about dealing with the 1 or 2 new lot creation annually on islands, but we have forgotten about the thousands upon thousands of current water access only people that we are not supporting in this official plan to help encourage. We dealt with Skeleton Lake recently, where a marina was threatening to close, and we had to look at different alternatives to make sure we protected that water access landing for those properties. And I'm wondering, is there a policy that we want to consider that encourages continued use or expansion of waterfront landings in here? Because the problem is not the 1 or 2 new lots. The problem is the thousands of existing lots, should these marinas decide they want to get out of that business and don't like renting boat slips.
It's a very good point, Mayor Harding. And Mr. McDonald, would that fold into our marinas section? Thoughts on that?
Yes, Chair Bridgman, that's an excellent suggestion. I guess what we're all trying to say is that marinas and waterfront landings serve a greater long-term public interest in terms of providing long-term access to those folks that need it. And I think along the lines of what the mayor is suggesting, that the official plan should be supportive of retaining existing landings and existing marinas. So when we say in item D of the recommendation, I think that should be expanded to include waterfront landings as well, so that we're clear on it. And we'll consider how we can further support that through the policy framework we develop after this meeting. But I think both of those things should be supported going forward.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Edwards.
Thank you. Further to the mayor's point, there are thousands and thousands of boats being parked at somewhere like Parker's or other landings. We should maintain them. They've got to be saved, because a resort closes. Yes, you lose some jobs and everything else for that. If these marinas or landings close, there's millions of dollars on these islands that are up the creek, basically, without somewhere to park. So we've got to make it as strong as possible on not down zoning marinas or other landings that there are there, because it is important to the whole area. Thank you.
We'll see how Mr. McDonald and Mr. Diamond work their magic on the wording of that, Councillor Edwards. Councillor Mazan.
Thank you, and through you, and I support those comments. I am also wondering, and if we could have a clear definition of the difference between a marina and a landing. Just coming out of our meetings from last week, I realized that we don't really have a clear understanding of those. And then again, extending it just beyond the world of marinas. Mr. Potter brought up the Golf and Country Club. I have no idea how many people we are talking about there, but I suspect there's quite a few that may use that as their primary deeded plot. And I know there's multiple spots like that's right the lakes. So we just ask that those definitions are clear as well. Thank you.
So, Mr. McDonald, Councillor Mazan raised this last week, and I think the defining difference is whether it's zoned commercial or whether it's zoned non-commercial. But in terms of the actual listing of what's allowed and not allowed, I think that's, if I can, Councillor Mazan, that's where you're coming from. So I don't know, more than explaining that, I don't really have any more comments. I don't know if you want to make a comment on that.
Actually, I'd like to ask Mr. Pink to provide his thoughts. I mean, he's been dealing with this for years, so he can probably unpack the differences better than I.
Mr. Pink.
Thank you, Chair. I think at the onset, what I would say is it's largely a zoning bylaw definition matter, not so much an official plan policy getting into the distinction between the two. But I think the discussion last week really revolved around, there's obviously different service levels in a marina. And I think we were struggling with trying to define that for that specific property. But our zoning bylaw currently does contain clear definitions of a marina, and it currently contains a clear definition of a landing. But the definition of a marina is, I think, as it needs to be, somewhat flexible. It may have boat sale, it may have boat repair, may have boat hire, may have boat storage, and access to the lake, and it can be any combination of those things. But it's difficult when we want to be more prescriptive and say it must sell fuel or it must repair boats. So the definition is somewhat flexible, but there is that commercial component where a landing predominantly doesn't have those additional services, but does provide the access to water body. I think the overarching theme here. I think we're supportive of the direction that Mr. McDonald is suggesting we go. It resolves the concerns we've heard. I think the other piece, I think it's very well taken, and it is noted in D, that we need to be very supportive of the existing marinas and landings. The D just states marinas. I think we can certainly include landings in that as well. The current official plan actually goes so far as identifying marinas as employment lands. I question the appropriateness of that, but we will make sure in the next draft that the policies are very clear and provide very large hurdles in order to downzone a marina property. The other thing, and I think it's a broader discussion, but it did come up during the General and Finance Committee discussion on Skeleton Lake last week. As committee members are aware, the municipality is also going through a transportation master plan. And through that process, council could explore the utilization of municipal lands for parking and docking as a potential solution if marinas and landings do reduce in number and access becomes an issue. So I think that will become part of that process discussion. But through this OP, we will ensure supportive policies for marinas and landings, make it very difficult to or discourage their businesses closing. And I think again we made some good suggestions, Mr. McDonald, Mr. Diamond, on pivoting on this policy direction. I hope that helps clarify.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Pink. Okay, so Mr. McDonald, Mr. Diamond, I believe you obviously have support for the direction that this is going in, and then we had a few other items that I'm sure you have you will contemplate, which is the guest parking and the private clubs, the lot creation really tightened, and then the other issue that the mayor raised was, what do we do when a marina closes down with all of our island property? So I think I captured the main part of that. So if you're good with that, then we will carry on to the next one. But